Growing up, I did a lot of babysitting, and I would most often babysit my younger cousins who were several years younger than me. One of my cousins in particular, he was a troublemaker. As soon as his mom left, he would turn into a complete monster. He would run around the house screaming, he would pinch his brother to make him cry, and he pretty much would just do the opposite of anything that I told him. Now, most kids are bribed by candy or toys or ice cream, but my cousin, he was bribed by the story of David and Goliath. It was by far his favorite. So, one time when I was babysitting him, I told him that if he was good, that I would read him the story of David and Goliath. And immediately he turned into a little angel. He did everything I told him, he played nicely with his brother, ate all his dinner, and after he ate, I read him the story. And his favorite part was when he got to hear about the battle. He would act it out and pretend like he was David. Now, this didn't last very long. I was able to do this with him a couple of times before he figured out that I was just trying to make him be good. He turned quickly back into a terror, except now he was still acting out the battle, but I was Goliath and his toys were the stones. For a while, I was able to captivate him with this simple story of a young shepherd defeating the armor-clad giant. Now, we've all heard the story of David and Goliath. For most of us, it was one of the first Bible stories that we ever heard, whether we were raised in church or not. And it's because it's so common that I think that we often gloss over a lot of the details. Now, the way most of us hear this story is of a shepherd boy who, against all odds, kills the armor-clad giant, and everyone else there was just too afraid to face him. This boy did this with only a stone and a sling and a whole lot of faith. This is often used by preachers to demonstrate that God is always on our side, and with God we can always triumph against anyone or anything that comes against us. Or sometimes they might throw in that through our faith, God will act with us in order to accomplish His will. And while this is all good and true, it's only part of the truth that this message, I think, is communicating. When we look at the passage a little deeper, when we look at the details, we see another side to the story. The story we think we know begins to look just a little bit different. Now I'm going to begin in 1 Samuel 17, verse 1. Where it reads, "Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered in Soka, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soka and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, while the Israelites were on the mountain on the other side, with the valley in between them. And there came from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head and was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armors on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him." So 6 cubits and a span is about 9 feet, 9 inches, which is almost twice my height. And 5,000 shekels is about 126 pounds, which for just the coat of mail, that's pretty heavy. So basically there's this guy who's nearly 10 feet tall. He's covered head to toe in heavy-duty armor. And it's pretty clear that he's very strong because, I mean, his armor weighs well over 100 pounds. And beyond this, the giant has a shield that is carried in front of him by another soldier. And on top of all of that, he has some serious weaponry in hand, with both a javelin and a spear, which all adds up to a pretty menacing picture. Now, it's easy to see why Israel would fear Goliath, especially since he comes out crossing the battle line and taunts Israel. We see this in verses 8 through 11 of chapter 17, which says, "He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, 'Why have you come to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? Are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, then we will become your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us.' And the Philistines said, 'I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together.' When Saul and all Israel heard the words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid." Now, Israel was frightened for good reason. Not only is their adversary openly taunting them, but he is enormous and menacing in appearance. The Philistines were clearly aware of the fact that any man who would come against Goliath would have a terrible time fighting against him with any sword or spear, because Goliath's sheer size and might would easily prevent any attack. And beyond that, Israel no longer had any true leadership. Yes, Saul is still king, and yes, he's there with the Israelites, but he's no longer anointed by God. He lost that. And he also has made no move to actually vanquish this giant that's come against him and his army. And what those in this story that don't realize is that David, the young shepherd, has already been secretly anointed by the king, or anointed king by Samuel. So for 40 days, Saul does little other than listen to the Philistine taunt him and his people. Then the scene shifts, and we see a young shepherd who brings rations that are sent by his father to his 3 older brothers, who are all on the battlefield serving in Saul's army. The author of 1 Samuel takes time here to emphasize the apparent insignificance of David and his family, none of whom have any sort of rank or title. David comes into the encampment and goes to his brothers at the battle lines, where he sees as the men flee from Goliath. And this is where we pick up the text again, in verse 25. "And the men of Israel said, 'Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel.' And David said to the men who stood by him, 'What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?' And people answered him in the same way, 'So shall it be done to the man who kills him.' Now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, 'Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle.' And David said, 'What have I done now? What was it not but a word?' And he turned away from him and toward another, and spoke in the same way. And the people answered him again as before." David's response to Goliath and his taunts were very much unlike the response of Israel and Saul. Because Israel and Saul just cowered in fear. The men of Israel speak of Goliath with amazement. And then we have David, who responds to their amazement with derision and mocking. David's response is to point out that the men of Israel are simply responding out of fear of what they see, rather than operating out of the knowledge that they are God's chosen people. David saw the situation through the eyes of faith and knowledge that God can conquer any enemy. Only David's brothers respond fully to his questions and declaration, but only to put him in his place. David's eldest brother feels like he's operating out of a youthful insolence. But David only moves on from his brothers and continues to speak to the men of Israel. He's unwilling to give up, knowing that faith, not fear, is how Israel should respond to the Philistines' threat. Next, we finally see Saul act, at least in some capacity, as king in verses 31 through 37. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and will fight the Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against the Philistine and fight with him. You are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father. When there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant was struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." And David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion, from the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." What Saul didn't seem to realize is that God was with David from the very beginning. If we go back to chapter 16, verse 13, we read that the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward, that day being the day that David was anointed king of Israel. When the people of Israel asked for a king, they requested a king who may judge them and may go out before them and fight their battles. Saul wouldn't go out before his people to vanquish the armor-clad giant. But what he didn't realize is that he's now sending the anointed king to do so for him. This is the first step that we see of David becoming the king over Israel. Now, we all know that David was acting within his anointing by stepping out into battle. After all, he was anointed king just the chapter before this. And per the request of the people, it was the king's duty to lead the way into battle. And this is exactly what David was doing. He acted within his anointing as king to lead his people into battle. Even though he was the only one who knew that he had this anointing. As a child, I think we often find it inspiring to know that even the smallest among us, or the most insignificant, can accomplish great things with God on our side. David speaks with confidence and unwavering faith throughout this narrative, just as we should when we are facing opposition. So why don't we always have the same confidence? I don't know about you, but I often find that I lose confidence in my calling from God. Maybe the giants in life are tearing you down, making you feel weak. I know they do me. What we need to recognize from the story is that we are weak, but only God can make us strong. What I think we often overlook is that God saw Goliath's one weakness, that his face was bare. A weakness that Goliath didn't see for himself, and God used it to bring Goliath down. But David was also weak because he was far smaller and he didn't have the same armor. But that never stopped him from stepping out in faith. And even though we are weak, it is our weakness that really matters. It isn't our weakness that really matters. What matters is how we react to the trials we face. What matters is that we act out in God's anointing in our lives and boldly have faith that God and his will is accomplished. When we do face our giants, we also need to recognize that God sees our weaknesses far better than we do. God knows how we should defeat them, and it is our job to step out in faith, knowing that God has a plan. Others aren't always aware of our anointing. And like David, we cannot allow those who are unaware to deter us from our mission. Because David wasn't just a young shepherd, but an anointed king, taking his first step toward leading his people. So we really have two options. We can be like the men of Israel and cower and feel that we weren't strong enough, or we can take courage in knowing that we are the children of God. And like David, have faith that God is always with us. This doesn't guarantee our victory, but it does mean that when we work within God's anointing in our lives and boldly step out in faith like David, God will prevail against the seemingly invincible armor-clad giant.